The Pacific sky shimmered in the late summer of 1943, its silence broken by the growl of approaching engines. Japanese pilots of the Imperial Navy, veterans of 2 years of sweeping victories, banked their Mitsubishi A6M0s into formation. For them, the outcome of another clash with American fighters seemed predetermined. The Zero had been their sword and shield since Pearl Harbor, a marvel of agility and range that had humbled Allied pilots from Malaya to the Philippines. They expected once again to dominate the skies. But this time, the enemy was different. Out of the clouds roared the Grumman F-6F Hellcat. Heavier, broader-winged, its engine note deeper, its silhouette far less graceful than the slender Zero. At first sight, Japanese pilots dismissed it as another clumsy attempt by the Americans to challenge their supremacy. Yet the moment the fight began, that confidence began to crack. Contrails spiraled across the sky as the two forces collided. Japanese pilots pitched their Zeros upward, seeking to outclimb the newcomers, a maneuver that had humiliated Wildcats and Buffaloes in the early days of war. To their astonishment, the Hellcats matched them climb for climb, their powerful Pratt Whitney R-2800 engines thundering as they surged higher still. When the Zeros tried to twist into tight turns, the Hellcats simply rolled into dives, plunging with such speed that their opponents could not follow without risking structural failure. One Japanese pilot later wrote, "We thought the Americans had built a flying tank, but it was faster than us, stronger than us, and it carried more guns." For the men who had once trusted in the Zero's invincibility, it was a moment of disbelief that lingered long after the battle ended. The Hellcat's 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns spat streams of fire that tore through Zero formations. The fragile Japanese fighters, built for lightness and range, could not withstand such punishment. Wings shredded, engines flared, and cockpits erupted in fire. Survivors who managed to return to their bases recounted the horror of facing a plane that seemed to shrug off damage while striking back with brutal efficiency. Below, sailors on American carriers watched the duels unfold against the blue expanse. They saw Hellcats returning with wings riddled with holes, yet still able to land safely on deck. Pilots climbed from cockpits drenched in sweat, their voices hoarse as they described the stunned expressions of Japanese adversaries who had expected easy kills, only to be cut from the sky. For the Japanese, the encounter was more than a lost skirmish. It was the first sign of an approaching storm. Since 1941, their faith in the Zero had been absolute. The fighter had embodied Japan's daring gamble for empire, carrying them across half the Pacific. Now, in a single clash, that faith was shaken. The enemy had unveiled a weapon designed specifically to erase the Zero's advantages. In ready rooms and mess halls across Pacific airfields, Japanese pilots debated the meaning of what they had seen. Could this new fighter be a one-off? Was it simply an upgraded Wildcat, nothing more? But reports trickled in from Solomon Islands patrols, from the Gilberts and the Marshalls. The same bulky, relentless fighter was appearing again and again. The conclusion was inescapable. The skies were no longer theirs alone. As 1943 drew to a close, the Imperial Japanese Navy faced a sobering realization. Their beloved Zero, once hailed as the master of the air, now had a rival it could not easily defeat. The balance that had favored Japan in the early years of war was beginning to tip. And for the young pilots who had sworn oaths to defend the empire, the first encounters with the Hellcat left them with a chilling question. If the Americans could field such machines in growing numbers, how long could Japan's warriors endure? This was the first shock, the moment when confidence faltered and doubt crept into the hearts of Japan's finest aviators. What they had witnessed was not just a new aircraft, but the opening chapter of a transformation in the Pacific Air War, one that would grow ever more decisive in the months to come. Before the Hellcat ever darkened the Pacific skies, the Mitsubishi A6M0 reigned supreme. Between 1940 and 1942, it was more than a fighter. It was a legend, the embodiment of Japan's aerial might. Its rise was so dramatic, so unchallenged, that many Allied pilots who first encountered it believed they were facing a machine beyond the limits of engineering. The Zero was born from the vision of Jiro Horikoshi, the chief designer at Mitsubishi. Tasked with creating a fighter for the Imperial Japanese Navy, Horikoshi defied convention. Where Western engineers built heavier planes to survive combat, Horikoshi pursued lightness and agility. Using innovative alloys, removing armor plating, and reducing weight wherever possible, he crafted an aircraft of astonishing performance. With a maximum speed of 331 miles per hour and a combat range of nearly 1,900 miles, twice that of many American fighters, the Zero could appear where it was least expected, linger in the skies, and still return home. Its agility stunned even seasoned aviators. Allied pilots soon discovered that in a turning fight, the Zero was untouchable. Against the US P-40 Warhawk, the F-4F Wildcat, and even Britain's Spitfire in the Eastern Theater, the Zero's superior maneuverability allowed Japanese pilots to dictate the tempo of combat. The plane could climb steeply, roll effortlessly, and strike with twin 7.7mm machine guns and two 20mm cannons, devastating armament for its time. From the skies over China in 1940 to the morning of December 7, 1941, at Pearl Harbor, the Zero demonstrated its lethal dominance. On that day, escorting bombers across Oahu, the fighter easily outmatched America's defending planes. Over the Philippines, the Malay Peninsula, and the Dutch East Indies, Allied squadrons were decimated by Zeros flown by veteran Japanese aviators. In places like Burma and Singapore, British and Commonwealth pilots, long accustomed to thinking of the Spitfire as invincible, were stunned when Japanese aircraft turned inside their maneuvers and struck them from behind. One American pilot who survived those early clashes later reflected that to fight the Zero was to fight a ghost. You could never catch it, and if you made one mistake, it was on your tail. Such testimonies fueled a myth around the aircraft. The Zero was not just a fighter, it was thought to be unbeatable. This aura of invincibility deeply influenced Japanese air doctrine. Pilots trained to rely on the Zero's unmatched maneuverability, confident that superior skill and agility would always overcome the enemy. In 1942, this belief seemed justified. At the Battle of Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway, Zeros shielded Japanese carriers with ferocity, tearing through waves of American torpedo bombers and dive bombers. Although Japan suffered strategic defeats, the Zero itself continued to inspire awe. By the end of 1942, the aircraft had claimed thousands of victories across the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Its long range enabled operations over vast distances, striking fear into defenders who could not understand how Japanese planes reached them. On bases and in briefing rooms, Allied commanders wrestled with the problem. They had no fighter that could match the Zero directly. The success of the aircraft also bred overconfidence. Japanese pilots came to believe the Zero would always secure the skies. Training emphasized offensive spirit and close-range dogfighting, while neglecting defensive tactics or the realities of attrition. The Navy produced skilled but irreplaceable aces, each one considered the embodiment of the warrior spirit. Few imagined that the balance could shift, or that the very features that gave the Zero its supremacy, its light frame, its lack of armor, its absence of self-sealing fuel tanks, would become fatal weaknesses when confronted by a new generation of American fighters. For now, in the early years of the war, the Zero stood as the symbol of Japan's ascendancy. To face it was to face near certain defeat. To fly it was to feel untouchable. From Pearl Harbor to the jungles of Guadalcanal, its shadow loomed over every battle. Yet, even as Japanese pilots toasted their victories and trusted in their aircraft's perfection, engineers and commanders on the other side of the Pacific were studying its flaws. The reign of the Zero would not last forever. Even as the Zero dominated skies from Pearl Harbor to Guadalcanal, American engineers were quietly preparing a counterstroke. At Grumman's plant in Bethpage, New York, a new machine was taking shape, one designed not to match the Japanese Zero on its terms, but to outlast, outgun, and ultimately overwhelm it. That fighter was the F-6F Hellcat. The Hellcat first flew in June 1942, only months after the shock of Pearl Harbor and during the early battles of the Pacific. Its design reflected the lessons of those opening campaigns, when U.S. pilots flying F-4F Wildcats often found themselves at a deadly disadvantage. The Wildcat was rugged but underpowered. In a dogfight, the Zero could turn inside it with ease. American aviators had survived only through teamwork and tactics, not superior machines. The Navy demanded a new fighter, fast, strong, and forgiving enough for carrier decks. Grumman's engineers responded with brute force. The Hellcat was built around the mighty Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine that delivered more than 2,000 horsepower. This engine gave the aircraft both speed and climbing power, allowing it to match and exceed the Zero in vertical combat. The Hellcat's frame was heavier and sturdier, with armor plating to protect the pilot and self-sealing fuel tanks to prevent the catastrophic fires that plagued the Zero. Its 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns delivered a withering storm of fire, tearing apart enemy aircraft with a single well-aimed burst. The contrast with the Zero was stark. Where Horikoshi had shaved every ounce of weight for agility, Grumman embraced strength and resilience. American pilots would later say that the Hellcat could take punishment and still return to the carrier, an advantage measured in lives saved. In one pilot's words, paraphrased from his post-war memoir, the Hellcat didn't need to dance with the Zero. It just had to keep swinging until the other guy broke. The process of bringing this warplane from prototype to mass production revealed the scale of America's industrial response. At Bethpage, the Grumman plant expanded rapidly, employing thousands of workers, many of them women who had stepped into wartime roles. Assembly lines hummed day and night, producing Hellcats at a pace the Japanese could scarcely imagine. By the end of the war, more than 12,000 F-6FS had rolled off American production lines. This industrial output dwarfed Japan's efforts. The Mitsubishi Company, straining under resource shortages and bombing raids, produced only a fraction of that number. The Imperial Navy might field a few hundred fighters at a time, but the United States could deploy Hellcats by the thousands, replenishing losses as fast as they occurred. Each American carrier that joined the fleet brought with it a new squadron of Hellcats, transforming the balance of air power across the Pacific. The Hellcat was not without flaws. It was heavier and less nimble in a tight turn than the Zero, and in a one-on-one duel, an inexperienced pilot might still fall victim to Japan's veterans. But the U.S. had built more than an aircraft, it had built a system. Training programs produced waves of new aviators, and the Hellcat's forgiving handling made it an ideal platform for pilots fresh from flight school. What the Zero demanded in finesse, the Hellcat compensated with durability and firepower. By late 1943, as the first squadrons of F-6FS began to deploy in combat, Japanese pilots who once believed their Zero untouchable now faced a rude awakening. The bulky, blue-painted Hellcat could not only climb with them, it could outdive, outshoot, and return home even after absorbing damage. In the words of one Japanese pilot, remembered after the war, "We thought the Zero would always rule the sky. Then came the Hellcat, and it was as if the Americans had built a plane only to destroy us." The legend of the Zero was about to collide with the reality of American industry, and the skies over the Pacific would never look the same again. By 1943, the Zero's aura of invincibility had already begun to crack. Yet it was in the vast blue arenas of the Solomon Islands, the Gilberts, and later the Marianas that the truth became undeniable. The Hellcat had turned the tide. The Solomons saw the first major test. Over Guadalcanal, American carrier groups and land-based squadrons pushed back waves of Japanese aircraft. For the first time, the Zeros found themselves unable to dictate the terms of battle. A Hellcat could take a burst of cannon fire, keep flying, and still send its adversary spiraling into the sea. Pilots returning to their carriers described the shock of watching Japanese opponents try the same daring maneuvers that once spelled certain victory, only to see them fail against the heavier, faster American fighter. In the Gilberts and Marshalls, the duel intensified. The carriers USS Essex, Yorktown, and Lexington launched raid after raid, their air wings packed with Hellcats. Each sortie whittled away at Japan's reserves of veteran pilots. The Zero's edge and agility could not compensate for dwindling experience in the cockpit. As one Japanese aviator recalled after the war, "We had the same aircraft, but not the same pilots. Every mission, we returned with fewer of our best." Then came the crucible of June 19th to 20th, 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. It was here that the legend of the Zero met its reckoning. When Japanese Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa launched his carrier's air groups toward the American Fifth Fleet, He hoped to blunt the U.S. invasion of the Marianas. What followed became infamous as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Hundreds of Japanese planes, many of them Zeros flown by inexperienced replacements, soared toward the American task force. Awaiting them were swarms of Hellcats, directed by superior radar coordination and flown by disciplined, well-trained pilots. In wave after wave, the results were catastrophic for Japan. By nightfall, over 300 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed, most of them Zeros, for the loss of fewer than 30 American planes. Eyewitnesses from both sides described the same chilling imbalance. One Hellcat pilot later paraphrased, "They came at us in streams, but it was like shooting targets at a range. Their planes couldn't climb with us, couldn't dive with us, and they burned too easily." For the Japanese, it was a nightmare. A surviving Zero pilot admitted in his diary, "We were flying into death. The Americans always seemed above us, always faster." The devastation was not limited to machines. Each Zero shot down often carried one of Japan's dwindling cadre of aviators. Where once the Imperial Navy had fielded squadrons of elite, battle-hardened men, by 1944 many cockpits were filled by boys rushed through training. Against them stood American pilots who had spent months in rigorous preparation, flying aircraft that forgave their mistakes and magnified their strengths. The battle ended with the destruction of Japan's carrier air arm as an effective fighting force. The Hellcat's kill ratio, claimed at nearly 19-1 during the campaign, told the story in brutal numbers. Japan's faith in the Zero, so central to its early war doctrine, had become a fatal weakness. The skies over the Pacific had shifted. No longer could Japanese commanders send their Zeros aloft with confidence that they would return. Each encounter now tilted toward the Americans, who could not only replace their aircraft but their pilots in endless waves. For the men of the Zero, the realization was bitter. The aircraft that had carried them to triumph in 1941 was now leading them into slaughter. The clash over the Pacific was more than a contest of machines. It was the moment when Japan's dream of aerial supremacy collapsed under the weight of American industry, training, and technology. The war in the air had reached a turning point, but the struggle was far from over. Ahead lay the desperate final battles, where Japan would throw every last resource into the skies in a fight it could no longer hope to win. The collapse of the Zero's dominance in 1943 and 1944 forced Japan into a frantic search for answers. Once confident in their aerial supremacy, the Japanese military now confronted the sobering truth that their most celebrated fighter could no longer match the Hellcat. Engineers, commanders, and pilots scrambled for solutions, but every path forward was blocked by shortages, attrition, and the relentless pressure of American industry. In Tokyo and Nagoya, design bureaus rushed new aircraft into development. The Kawanishi N-1K George, with its powerful Hamar engine and heavy armament, was intended to match the Hellcat in speed and climb. Likewise, the Nakajima Ki-84 Frank, deployed primarily by the Army Air Force, promised to restore Japanese pride in the skies. On paper, these fighters offered a glimpse of parity. In practice, they arrived too late and in too few numbers. Chronic shortages of high-octane fuel meant engines underperformed, while the lack of refined alloys resulted in structural weaknesses. Pilots trained on these newer machines often lacked the hours necessary to exploit their potential. Many were hastily graduated cadets who had spent more time in classrooms than cockpits. By contrast, American aviators benefited from a rotational system. After a tour of duty in the Pacific, they returned home, their hard-won experience preserved for future squadrons. New pilots arrived better trained, mentored by veterans, and equipped with aircraft that could take punishment and deliver lethal firepower. Japanese squadrons, once the pride of the Pacific, now resembled shells of their former selves. One veteran later wrote, "Our aircraft could not climb as promised, our fuel was watered down, and the boys beside me were no longer samurai, but children sent to slaughter." Desperation also bred tactical innovation, but even here Japan faced insurmountable odds. Pilots experimented with head-on attacks against bomber formations or tried to lure Hellcats into turning fights closer to the deck, where the Zero still retained agility. Yet American pilots, disciplined and supported by superior radar and communications, adapted quickly. The Hellcat could dive away with impunity, then climb back into the fight, its rugged frame shrugging off hits that would have shredded a Zero or George. Each encounter drained Japan further. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had already gutted the Imperial Navy's carrier aviation. Now, land-based air units attempted to stem the tide during the battles for the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Fuel depots were bombed, factories lay in ruins, and the supply of spare parts dwindled to nothing. Aircraft sat idle for lack of engines, while pilots were asked to fly missions they knew would end in flames. Morale withered under the weight of these realities. Diaries from young aviators reveal the despair of men sent into impossible fights. One entry, preserved after the war, noted, "We rise into the sky knowing the enemy will be waiting above us. We do not return. Every day, fewer come back." By late 1944, Japan's tactics shifted from desperate defense to sacrificial offense. The introduction of kamikaze attacks reflected not confidence in new designs, but the collapse of faith that conventional aircraft could regain control of the skies. The Hellcat, with its overwhelming numbers and near-total dominance, had rendered traditional dogfighting obsolete. For Japanese engineers, every innovation was undone by the relentless math of war. Even as they produced the George and Frank, America delivered Hellcats by the thousands, over 12,000 by war's end. Factories in Bethpage and beyond operated day and night, ensuring that every lost American fighter was swiftly replaced. Japan, by contrast, produced only a fraction of its planned advanced fighters, crippled by material shortages and Allied bombing. The struggle symbolized the broader collapse of the empire's war machine. What had begun with the audacity of Pearl Harbor and the brilliance of the Zero had devolved into a grim, holding action fought with dwindling resources. Each new Japanese aircraft was a technical marvel on paper, but in the skies, where fuel was scarce and pilots were untested, they became little more than desperate countermoves against an enemy that had outbuilt, outreigned, and outlasted them. The Pacific was now America's domain. Japan's dream of air superiority had been buried under waves of Hellcats. The next chapter would reveal just how deeply this imbalance of power defined the final phase of the war, as Japan turned increasingly to last-ditch measures that reflected not strength, but despair. By late 1944, the once-proud Mitsubishi Zero, a symbol of Japanese dominance in the early Pacific War, had been reduced to a tool of desperation. Outclassed by the rugged Grumman Hellcat in speed, climb, and firepower, the Zero could no longer win the duels it once commanded. The Imperial Japanese Navy, battered at the Battle of the Philippine Sea and crippled in the skies above the Marianas, faced a stark choice: concede the air war or find a new, terrifying way to fight. They chose the latter. The birth of the kamikaze, Divine Wind, was less a tactical innovation than an act of despair. In October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Japan first unleashed waves of suicide pilots against the American fleet. Stripped of their traditional role as nimble fighters, Zeros were packed with 500-pound bombs or fitted with additional fuel tanks to ignite on impact. Pilots, often barely out of training, were ordered to hurl themselves at carriers, battleships, and transports. For the men flying Hellcats, the change in enemy tactics was both shocking and sobering. No longer did they face opponents seeking survival through skillful maneuver. Instead, they confronted pilots who expected, even intended, not to return. "We used to fight men trying to live," one Hellcat pilot later reflected. "Now we fought men who had already accepted death." The Pacific skies became a grim stage for this last gamble. At Leyte, off the Philippines, American task forces braced under the first organized kamikaze waves. Over the following months, during the invasions of Iwo Jima in February 1945 and Okinawa in April, the suicide attacks multiplied. More than 1,500 kamikaze sorties were launched in the Okinawa campaign alone, sinking dozens of Allied ships and damaging hundreds more. Yet the price Japan paid was catastrophic. Each kamikaze consumed a precious aircraft, and each sortie cost a young life that could never be replaced. Hellcats, now acting as tireless fleet defenders, were scrambled in constant patrols, intercepting Zeros before they could dive onto the carriers below. Contrails scarred the skies above Okinawa as American pilots raced to intercept spiraling attackers. Many kamikazes broke through, plunging into decks in fiery explosions, but far more were cut down by the .50 caliber guns of the Hellcat or shredded by naval anti-aircraft fire. For the young Japanese pilots, the mission was a haunting farewell. Diaries later recovered revealed a mix of patriotism, resignation, and sorrow. One 19-year-old cadet wrote on the eve of his flight, "I hope my death will be worthy of Japan. I pray only that my sacrifice delays defeat." But defeat was not delayed. For every ship struck, dozens survived, protected by the relentless American combat air patrols. The Hellcat's dominance ensured that kamikaze losses vastly outstripped any damage inflicted. By 1945, Allied fleets had learned to adapt, dispersing formations, reinforcing decks, and deploying radar-guided picket ships to give early warning. The kamikaze campaign inflicted pain, but it could not alter the outcome. What had once been the symbol of Japanese mastery in the air had become the instrument of its despair. The Zero, revered for its elegance and agility, was now remembered for its final chapter, as a flying coffin hurled at overwhelming odds. For the Americans, victory in the skies was no longer in doubt. For Japan, the kamikaze revealed not strength, but the tragic collapse of hope. As the war neared its end, the Zero's proud silhouette still appeared against the Pacific horizon, but no longer as a predator. Instead, it was a harbinger of tragedy, a sign that Japan had staked its fate on the sacrifice of its youngest sons. The Hellcats, unshaken, continued to patrol. The battle for air supremacy was over. The final chapter would reveal the legacy of this desperate struggle, how the Zero, once unmatched, came to embody both the heights of Japanese innovation and the depths of its despair. As the guns of the Pacific War finally fell silent in August 1945, the legacy of its most iconic aircraft was already etched into history. Two fighters, once mortal enemies in the skies, had come to symbolize the rise and fall of empires. The Mitsubishi A6M0, once hailed as invincible, and the Grumman F6F Hellcat, the rugged machine that broke its myth, remained forever intertwined in the memory of those who fought. The Zero was remembered with a mixture of awe and tragedy. When it first appeared in 1940, it represented the pinnacle of Japanese aeronautical engineering, a lightweight marvel capable of astonishing range and breathtaking maneuverability. In the opening campaigns across China, the Philippines, and the Pacific, it humiliated Allied fighters, outturning and outflying everything placed against it. To Japanese pilots, it was not merely an aircraft but a national symbol, proof that Japan could stand against the West. Even as late as Pearl Harbor, many believed the Zero would remain untouchable. But the war exposed its flaws. Its designers had sacrificed armor and self-sealing fuel tanks for speed and agility, decisions that proved fatal once American fighters caught up. The Hellcat, arriving in 1943, was everything the Zero was not: durable, heavily armed, and backed by an industrial base that could replace losses almost overnight. For American pilots, the Hellcat became the great equalizer. Powered by the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, it could dive faster, climb higher, and withstand damage that would have torn the fragile Zero apart. By war's end, the Hellcat accounted for 75% of all aerial victories claimed by the U.S. Navy. More than 12,000 were built, and it created over 300 American aces. For young pilots, many barely out of training, the Hellcat was their shield and their sword. Japanese aviators, meanwhile, bore witness to the crushing realization of industrial inferiority. Post-war memoirs speak of their shock and despair the first time they saw Hellcats roar past their Zeros in vertical climbs. One veteran later reflected, "In the beginning, the Zero gave us wings of victory. In the end, it carried us only to our deaths." The beloved fighter of their youth had been outclassed, and no amount of bravery could reverse the tide. The contrast between the two machines revealed more than just differences in design. The Zero symbolized Japan's daring gamble, striking fast and hard before its enemies could mobilize. The Hellcat embodied America's industrial power and strategic patience, entering the war later but arriving in overwhelming numbers, refined by combat lessons, and built to last. Today, both aircraft occupy places of honor in museums and air shows around the world. The Zero is admired as a masterpiece of ingenuity, a reminder of Japan's early brilliance and the bravery of those who flew it. The Hellcat stands as a monument to Allied resilience and technological adaptation, the iron hammer that secured air supremacy in the Pacific. Yet beyond the statistics and the machines themselves lies a deeper legacy. The duels between Zero and Hellcat were not merely contests of steel and fire, but reflections of nations at war, one straining to hold its empire, the other surging forward with unstoppable momentum. Their encounters in the skies marked the turning points of a conflict that reshaped the world. In the end, the Hellcat's victory was not only over an aircraft, but over an idea, the belief that Japan's daring and skill could overcome America's factories and fleets. For the men in Zero cockpits, watching Hellcats outclimb them was the moment they understood the war was lost. The story that began with shock in the skies over the Pacific closes with reflection. Two planes, two nations, two destinies. The Zero, graceful, fragile, and tragic. The Hellcat, powerful, relentless, and decisive. Together, they tell the tale of an air war that decided the fate of the Pacific and left behind a haunting lesson. In modern war, courage alone could not match the weight of industry and strategy. And so, the image lingers, a Japanese pilot gazing upward in disbelief as a Hellcat soars past his beloved Zero. More than an aircraft's defeat, it was the symbol of an empire's fall.